Ooh, I'm live. Hi, YouTube. How's it going out there? Welcome back to my channel. My name's Miss Samantha, and I am here to read you some bedtime stories this evening. So I have a really adorable special book of mine here, Pete the Cat 5-Minute Bedtime Stories. And the wonderful thing about this book is it has a nice collection of all different bedtime stories for you. So I'm going to read you a couple of stories this evening. Let's see how far we get. Okay, so the first story we're going to read together is Pete the Cat and the Bedtime Blues. Pete and the gang are going to the beach. They've been having a groovy time in the surf and sand. But now the sun is starting to set. Pete is bummed out. He doesn't want the fun to end. But what can he do? They can't surf in the dark. Then Pete has an idea. Hey, he shouts. Why should our fun end just because the sun is tired? Let's have a sleepover at my house. That'll give us more time for tons of fun. Pete's friends love that idea. Groovy, says Gus. Will there be snacks? Asks Alligator. Grumpy Toad points to his motorcycle. Come on, let's go to Pete's place. The party at Pete's house is far out. The gang orders pizza and plays and plays and plays. Alligator throws around Pete's soccer ball. Gus goes for a ride on Pete's bike. Grumpy Toad drives Pete's remote control car. And Pete draws with his crayons. They look like they're having a really fun sleepover. The gang rolls out their sleeping bags and puts on their pajamas. Good night, Gus, Pete says, turning off the light. Good night, Alligator. Good night, Grumpy Toad. Good night, Pete, the friends call. Pete pulls his blanket up high. He fixes his sleeping cap. He squishes around to get comfortable. It has been a long, groovy day, but now he is ready for some shut-eye. Slowly, Pete's eyes close. He is about to catch some Z's when he hears a noise. Clap, clap, clap. Pete sits up and turns on the lights. Who did that? He asks. It was me, Grumpy Toad says. I'm not tired. I don't want to go to bed. I want to clap my hands instead. Pete covers his head. Let's clap tomorrow, he says. Right now, this cool cat needs to go to bed. Pete turns off the light again. Good night, Gus. Good night, Alligator. Good night, Grumpy Toad. Time to sleep. Good night, Pete, the friends call. Pete fluffs up his pillow. He pulls up his blanket. Then he closes his eyes. Pete is about to catch some Z's when he hears another noise. Rat-a-tat-tat. Pete turns on the lights again. Who did that? He asks. It was me, says Gus. I'm not tired. I don't want to go to bed. I want to jam. Pete shakes his head. That was a cool beat, but let's rock out tomorrow instead, he says. This cat needs his sleep. Pete turns off the light again. Good night, Gus. Good night, Alligator. Good night, Grumpy Toad. Time to sleep. Good night, Pete, the friends call. Pete rolls onto his left side. He rolls onto his right side. He's about to catch some Z's when he hears a loud munch. Pete knows that sound. He is sure it's Alligator. He is always up for eating. Pete turns on the light. Sure enough, Alligator is munching on a piece of pizza. Pete sighs. What can he do? All the clapping, rat-a-tat-tatting, and munching are giving him the bedtime blues. Then Pete has an idea. He gets out his favorite bedtime story and begins to read. As he reads, Pete notices the room is quiet. There is no more clapping, no more rat-a-tat-tatting, and no more munching. Pete looks up. His friends have gathered around him. They want to hear the story too. Pete turns back to the beginning of the book and begins to read it out loud. His friends settle down and listen. No one makes a sound. Pete yawns as he turns the last page of the book. He has been so focused on the story, he didn't even notice his friends creep off to their own beds. Good night, sleep tight, he whispers. Pete puts his book down. He turns off the lights and he closes his eyes. Soon, Pete is fast asleep. Dreams of another groovy day of surfing fill his head as the cool cat finally catches some Z's. That sounded like a really fun sleepover. I'm glad that Pete finally got to go to sleep, though. Okay, so the next story I'm going to read is Pete the Cat and the Lost Tooth. Oh no! Pete lost a tooth. What should he do? Pete shows the tooth to his mom. Put the tooth under your pillow, she says. The tooth fairy will come and give you money for it. Pete thinks under his pillow is a strange place for a tooth, but his mom is usually right, and it would be pretty cool to meet the tooth fairy. Pete puts the tooth under his pillow. Then he closes his eyes and pretends to sleep. Suddenly, he hears a jingling noise. Pete opens his eyes. The tooth fairy is at his window. Oh my goodness. The tooth fairy flies into Pete's room. She looks worried. What's wrong? Pete asks. It's a very busy night, the tooth fairy explains. I don't know how I'm going to collect all the teeth that fell out today. Pete jumps up. I can help, he says. The tooth fairy thinks that is an awesome idea. With a flick of her wand, she gives Pete the magic wings. Now he can fly just like her. Wow, Pete is lucky. He gets to be the tooth fairy's helper. Pete loves his new wings. He zips around his room and does loop-loops in the air. Groovy, he shouts. Finally, Pete settles down. So, he says, what do I have to do? The tooth fairy gives Pete a list of names. You need to visit each of these cool kids to get their lost teeth. Let's see. Oh, his list says Callie, Alligator, and Gus. The tooth fairy gives Pete 2 bags. One is full of teeth and one is full of coins. Take the tooth and put it in this bag, she says. Then leave a coin from this bag under the pillow. Pete looks at the bag of teeth. It already looks full. How will I fit any more teeth in here? He asks. The tooth fairy smiles. Oh, I wouldn't worry about that. Being a tooth fairy comes with a certain kind of magic. Far out, Pete says. He is ready to go.
Pete's first stop is Callie's house. He flies through the window and straight to her bed. Pete lifts up Callie's pillow. He takes her teeth and leaves behind a coin. Next up is Alligator's house. Pete finds Alligator's tooth. It is big and sharp. He pulls it out from under the pillow and puts a coin in its place. Then Pete sneaks back out the window. He smiles to himself. This job is easy. Pete's last stop is Gus. He flies inside and reaches under Gus's pillow. Uh-oh, there's no tooth. Pete looks next to Gus's drums. He looks in Gus's drawer. He even checks inside of Gus's baseball mitt. The tooth is nowhere to be found. That is one messy room. Does Pete panic? Nope. He just keeps looking for the tooth. And then Gus wakes up. Gus, Pete cries. I have been looking everywhere for your last tooth. Where is it? My tooth? Gus asks. Pete nods. I'm supposed to get it for the tooth fairy. But Pete, Gus says, platypuses don't have teeth. Gus opens his mouth and shows Pete. See? Far out, Pete says. No teeth at all. Gus shrugs. Sorry, it would have been nice to join in the tooth fairy fun. Pete smiles. No worries, he says. He takes a coin from his bag and slips it under Gus's pillow. Thank you, says Gus. You're welcome, Pete says. Good night. Pete leaves Gus's room and heads home. On his way, he comes across the tooth fairy. All done? She asks. Did you have any trouble? Pete shakes his head and holds out the 2 bags. Nope. Everything went great. That was awesome. Thanks, Pete, the tooth fairy says. She takes the bags. I should be getting on to my next house. As Pete makes his way home, he thinks about Gus. Not everyone is the same, but being kind is always cool. That sounds like the perfect title for his next song. The end. Okay, we're going to read one last story together this evening. This story is called Pete the Cat Out of This World. Pete is very happy. He has been chosen for a super groovy mission. He is going into outer space. He will be the first cat to walk on the moon. But first, Pete has to train. Check out that groovy spacesuit he has on. Pete goes in the zero gravity chamber. He spins and spins and spins. He learns how to drive a rover. Pete practices picking up small rocks. Pete goes to mission control. He learns how the astronauts speak to the crew on Earth. He learns how the rocket gets into space. And he learns how it lands. Finally, Pete is ready. Wow. Pete and the other astronauts climb into the space capsule. They buckle in and prepare for the flight. 5, 4, 3, 2, One, lift off! The ship shakes and rattles. A loud sound fills the cabin. Pete looks out the window. They are speeding through outer space. Super cool. The ship blasts past a satellite. A comet streaks by the window. The Earth grows smaller as the astronauts make their way to the moon. The trip to the moon takes a long time. Pete brings out his guitar. He plays a groovy interstellar song for the other astronauts. The astronauts float through the cabin to the beat of Pete's song. Mission Control listens in. Cool beat, Pete, they say. That looks like a fun experience. Finally, the rocket lands on the moon. Pete straps on his spacesuit. He opens the door and climbs down the ladder. His feet touch the ground. Pete and the other astronauts walk around. It is time to explore. Pete looks at the surface of the moon. It's bumpy and kind of dusty. Nothing like the ground at home. He climbs into the rover. He uses his training to drive over the surface of the moon. Pete collects moon rocks to bring back to Earth and maps the moon's surface. Pete's mission is almost complete, but first he has one more job to do. He straps on a jetpack and heads towards Mars. Pete takes a special camera out. He points it at the red planet and starts to take pictures. Pete zooms left. He zooms right. Snap, snap, snap. Soon he has thousands of pictures. Oh no! Pete lost track of time. He has drifted too far away from the moon. He has to make it back before the ship takes off for Earth. Pete refires his jetpack. He zooms towards the moon's surface. If he doesn't make it back, he'll be stuck in space forever. Phew! Pete makes it back just in time. The other astronauts are already back in the ship. Pete climbs aboard and straps himself in. The ship shakes and rattles as it takes off. Pete looks out the window. The moon grows smaller as the astronauts begin their journey back to Earth. Finally, the ship reaches the Earth's atmosphere. It touches down and taxis to a stop. Mission Control cheers. They are glad to have the astronauts home safe, and they can't wait to see the pictures of rocks that Pete collected. Pete's trip to outer space was out of this world. He's psyched to have his feet back on solid ground, but he hopes he gets to go up again soon. Mars seems like a groovy place to explore next. Rock it on, Pete. I think we have time for one more story. Okay, so this will be the final story we're going to read this evening. This story is called Pete the Cat Goes Camping. Ooh, I love camping. Pete is going camping with his family. This is his first camping trip. He can't wait. Camping sounds groovy. Pete and his brother Bob pack the car. They bring food, flashlights, fishing poles, and tents. Don't forget the sleeping bags, says Dad. He hands them to Pete. It is a long drive to the campsite. Finally, they arrive. Pete's mom and dad set up the tents. Pete and Bob go deep into the woods. They collect sticks to make a campfire. Pete and Bob decide to go for a hike. Bob shows Pete the footprints of all of the animals who live in the forest. They see bear tracks and deer tracks. One set of tracks looks like it belongs to a raccoon. Just then, a bunny hops past. He leaves another set of tracks in the dirt. Pete looks at a big footprint. Far out, he says. Look how big this is. Bob bends down. I don't know what animal made that, he says, but I bet it's not something we want to run into. Bob and Pete make their way back to the campsite. Their dad is waiting for them. Come on, boys, he says. It's time to catch our dinner. Pete's dad holds up a fishing rod. Who wants to try? Bob doesn't like fishing. He stays at the campsite to get the fire going. Pete wants to try. He and his dad go to the lake. They have to be very quiet so they don't scare away the fish. Finally, Pete feels something tug on his line. He caught something. Pete and his dad bring their catch back to the campsite. That was awesome, Pete says. Look what I caught. Pete's mom takes the fish from him. She cleans it and cooks it over the campfire. It is delicious. Great job, Pete. After dinner, Pete and his family gather around the fire to keep warm. It is getting dark out. Pete looks up at the sky. He has never seen so many stars before. How about a story? Pete's dad asks. Bob jumps up. I've got one, he shouts. Bob tells Pete and his parents all about a big, hairy giant who lives in the woods. Every night, he prowls the campsites looking for snacks, Bob says. In the morning, all that's left are crumbs and giant footprints. In fact, his feet are so big, he's called Bigfoot. Groovy story, Bob, Pete's mom says. And speaking of snacks, who wants a s'more? Pete's dad gives everyone a stick to toast marshmallows on. Pete's mom hands out the graham crackers and chocolate. Soon everyone is enjoying a yummy dessert. Pete can't stop thinking about Bob's story. What if Bigfoot is real? Don't let Bob scare you, Pete's mom says. No one has ever seen Bigfoot. But if he is real, Pete's dad adds, giving Pete another marshmallow, I bet he's friendly, and I bet he likes s'mores. That gives Pete an idea. He decides to make a s'more for Bigfoot. That way, if he does come, he'll have a tasty snack. Soon it is time for bed. Pete's dad puts out the fire, and Pete and Bob head to their tent. Pete snuggles into his sleeping bag. It's warm and cozy, but he can't sleep. The woods seem extra dark, and the forest seems extra loud. Oh, hello, Kiki. Kiki's here for a story. Come here, you want to read Pete the cat? Come here. Come here. Lay down, puppy. Come here. Sit. Sit. In your sweater. Okay, you want to help me read? Kiki's going to help me read now. Suddenly, Pete hears a weird swishing sound. He sits up and looks around. Bob, Pete says, what is that? Bob opens one eye and listens closely. It's just the wind, he says finally. Pete still can't sleep. He hears a strange hooting sound. Hoo-hoo. It's just an owl, Bob says. That makes Pete think of his old friend Owl. He starts to feel better, but then he hears a loud chirping noise. It's just the crickets, Bob says. Go to bed, Pete. Pete puts his pillow over his head. Maybe he can hide from the noises. Crack! Pete sits up again. Bob, did you hear that? He asks. But his brother is fast asleep. Pete hears another crack. He listens carefully. Is it Bigfoot? Pete opens the tent and looks around, but it's too dark to see anything. The next morning, Pete is the first one up. He rushes outside and looks around. He doesn't see any broken branches. There aren't any footprints. But then Pete sees the table. The s'more left for Bigfoot is gone. In its place is a note. It says, "Thanks for the treat. XOXO," and it is stamped with the biggest footprint Pete has ever seen. Oh my goodness, he got a visit from Bigfoot. Pete shows the note to his family. I knew Bigfoot was real, Bob shouts. Pete smiles. He knows now that Bigfoot isn't scary. Just because he looks different doesn't mean that Pete should be afraid of him. Pete starts looking for sticks. He can't wait to make another s'more for his groovy new friend Bigfoot. The end. Thank you so much for tuning in with me this evening. I hope you enjoyed tonight's bedtime stories. Make sure to tune in tomorrow and the rest of the week all through Friday to hear a bedtime story at 7:30 every night with me. Take care. Sleep tight, everybody.